There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Startup Chat, episode number 67. I'm here with Conrad Egusa. And Conrad, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. It took us a bit to get this organized. The first time we both kind of disappeared, and this time it took us 30 minutes to work out how to use Hangouts. So let's start with a bit of background. Who are you and what do you do?
Yes. My name is Conrad Egusa. My background has always been with startups and the media. I went to university in Northern California, I guess the region known as Silicon Valley, and I'd raised some funding for an angel investor-backed startup. And after that, I lived in New York, and I wrote for a tech publication called VentureBeat. And since then, I've founded a company called Publicize. It's trying to disrupt the PR industry. I co-own a publication called Columbia Reports, which is the largest English news publication in South America. And I also am involved with a few ventures in South America as well.
Nice. So what can you tell me about Publicize? So it's publicize.co, the address for your site, isn't it?
Yes. The idea stemmed actually from after leaving VentureBeat. A lot of people were encouraging me to help them with PR, and I actually didn't want to because traditionally the industry charges $10,000 a month, 6-month retainer, $60,000 cost that most companies can't afford, and it's hard to get an ROI on that. And the idea I had was, could I create the same service, but as opposed to charging $10,000 a month, charge closer to $400 a month? And it's grown pretty quickly. It's also month to month, so people can cancel. It's pretty limited risk. We work with close to a dozen Y Combinator companies. We've been lucky that people like Brad Feld, Guy Kawasaki, Steve Blank as well have been nice to write about us. Basically trying to kind of disrupt the industry.
So how do you do that? What is different about your company that enables you to do it cheaper, other than you're just getting started and you don't have the...
I think part of it is just that we've been able to deconstruct PR to a level that very few people have done. And actually part of what I really want to stress is that I think we're very, very good at what we do. But any startup or founder doesn't need to work with us to get featured on these top publications, whether it's TechCrunch, whether it's Huffington Post, or the BBC, etc. Any founder, if they approach PR in the right way, can get these type of results.
Cool. Well, before we get into that, which I'm sure everyone's keen to hear about, can you just give me a brief idea of what you guys do, like for the monthly service?
Yeah, absolutely. So normally what happens is we get contacted by someone saying, we're about to launch this mobile application as an example, and we really want to get featured on a site like TechCrunch. So what we do is we take this announcement, we add a ton of social proof, make it seem a lot bigger than really seem very big. Then depending on the announcement, what we usually do is secure an exclusive for the public for the announcement on a publication like a TechCrunch, a VentureBeat. Kind of depends on the specific vertical, of course. Then typically what happens is, let's say TechCrunch says, Conrad, we're going to publish the article this Wednesday. The article comes online, and then we further coverage through a lot of other publications. So smaller sites like Tech Cocktail, BetaBeat, and also like specific verticals as well. And so the idea is after this period, company's going to receive a high ROI on the service.
And so that happens when you launch, but what is if you're paying every month, what do you do for the other months?
Yeah, so a couple things. So typically it takes us, I usually recommend when a company is about to want to start to work with us, they wait a period of 3 to 4 weeks. And the reason why is typically when we work with the client, we'll say, okay, in the first week, we're going to get all the PR material, press release, etc., up to 90% the way there. That's our goal. Then they usually revise the material, and after 2 weeks, everything's finished. It usually takes 1 week to secure an exclusive, and then a few weeks after to further coverage. And the idea with PR that I think a mistake a lot of companies make is that, let's say in 2012 they raise $1 million in funding, and they get featured on TechCrunch as an example. And then they say, okay, in 2015, 2-3 years later, they raise their next round, then they get featured on Mashable as an example. And the challenge that they have with this is that there are actually so many opportunities in between these periods to get funding coverage, to get coverage. So as an example, let's say you found a startup and you announce your launch and you get on TechCrunch. Likely 3 months later, you might launch a new product. You might launch a mobile application. You might announce a milestone that you hit 10,000 users. So at each of these milestones, your goal is to get featured on these publications. So as an example, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the same. Perhaps you get featured on the Next Web 1 month, or Gigome for another one. So it's actually, I always recommend as much as possible that you can kind of strategize ahead of time and plan out, every 10 weeks, 10 to 12 weeks, ideally, to maximize these PR pushes.
So what does a plan look like if you're sort of like paying $400 a month? Are you looking to get one article in one publication each month, or is it like one every couple of months? Or
yeah, so in general, it's a PR push. We aim for every 10 to 12 weeks. But when you actually kind of map it out, it's not like day one and day two. It's actually, by the time the first engagement ends, it almost flows right into the second engagement, if that makes sense. So, for example, if someone says, hey, I want to launch in 1 month, 4 to 6 weeks later after that coverage, the furthering the coverage is dying down, because news cycles always end, they'll say, hey, okay, we're planning on the next month, in 1 month from now, to launch an announcement that we just reached 10,000 users, as an example, or we just rebranded the site, and now we want to prepare for that launch as well.
We're doing that at the moment, actually, because we're when we launched, I didn't really get, for this business, I didn't really get any press when we launched, but we've been gradually getting more press as the business has been going on. When we sort of think of something that feels like a story, we'll kind of try to reach out and get press for it. But we're a couple of weeks away from our first birthday, so we're kind of reaching out to people to get a little bit of content out there about that and what's happened over the last year. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits to PR that I think most people don't talk about is, I'm sure you've seen how much traffic you get from search. So I think most sites will get over 50% from search. And one of the things I don't think people talk about is that PR to me is a secret weapon to SEO. So when you have these high page rank sites linking to you, it's just it's kind of increased search for all of your site. So I think one of the reasons I like PR is I think if you do it really well, like you guys are doing, like many other companies do, you almost don't need to put nearly as much effort towards SEO in these other areas as well.
Yeah, I don't think about things in terms of SEO, because I think it's like I think people really overstate the importance of SEO, but I think PR and branding are probably the two most important things. Like, I think, like, especially if we're going to talk about like bootstrap startups who come up with an idea, if they can put out a really professional, slick-looking product and really well-executed brand, and then get noticed by enough people to get in front of, like, that could turn like a 12-month period where you don't know if what you're doing is working into a 1 month period where, like, you've got enough eyeballs on your idea to work out if people are actually going to pay you for it.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, it could be the difference between your business just flailing for months and months and months, or hitting it straight away, or missing straight away, which is equally as good if you decide you're not going to go ahead with it. So I think it's really, really important.
I mean, I agree 100%, and I think another thing about PR that I saw for my own companies is when I had one of my companies featured on TechCrunch, you just get this like sense of momentum that I rarely seen other marketing channels provide, just because you get this inflow of messages from friends kind of supporting you, and it's a really nice special feeling.
Yeah, I think the biggest benefit for us is just that proof. Like, people have seen my co-founder on TV, and they've seen us being mentioned on Inc.com and Forbes or whatever, and I think they just that proof alone, it's completely, you can't measure the benefit of that, but I think when people come to our site, they can tell that we're not just some dodgy little backyard company, even though I'm in my garage here. Hopefully they don't watch this video. But yeah, I think just that the proof, and the credibility that you get from a good brand, as well as being mentioned by other good brands, is probably like the number one benefit of getting that attention.
I mean, I agree 100%.
So what about the process? What let's say you're a new business owner, you've worked for a couple of months to get your idea going and you're ready to launch. What What's the process to go through to hopefully get landed on one of these sites?
Yeah, I think the first thing that any entrepreneur should know is that if you want to be featured on a leading publication, you have to have something to announce, something essentially new. So when I was writing for VentureBeat, I had a lot of friends come to me in New York. They'd say, Conrad, can you please write about my company? And I would say, sure, you're my friend. What do you have to announce? And they would say, well, we don't have anything to announce. And I'd say, well, if you don't have anything to announce, I can't write a story about it, even if you are my good friend. So a lot of people would then say, okay, well, what do I have to potentially announce? And typically in a startup life cycle, the following will occur. The first announcement is their launch. Typically, let's say 3 to 6 months later, they might announce new funding. This could be angel funding, maybe as low as 50, 100,000 to venture capital funding. Later on, another announcement, they might launch a mobile product. So whether it's maybe iOS, maybe it's Android, they might announce a milestone that they hit 100,000 users, or that another one is they acquired a company, maybe they brought in a special board of advisors. So kind of anything meaningful in a lot of ways.
What about just to interrupt you? What about things for smaller founders who are bootstrapping their own businesses? Like, if you want to use our business, that's fine. If that makes sense. Like we've never got funding. We don't plan on getting it. We're not acquiring anything. Like how do we fabricate a story that is interesting enough to your audience?
Yeah. So this is what I always recommend to people. So most founders, when they talk to a journalist, they say, okay, we're about to launch this product, and here's like XYZ. This is what the product does, kind of. And I think that's the wrong way to go about it, because a journalist can visit your website and they can find out what you do. That's not particularly interesting. What is interesting though is imagine that you're about to go to bed or you're about to go to the gym, and you're kind of daydreaming about how big WP curve is going to be in like 5 years. Maybe you'll have X number of employees or making X number of impact. That kind of vision of it, or maybe you've moved into other areas as well, other verticals. That's what you should describe. So maybe a good example of this is I founded a co-working space, kind of an entrepreneurial center in South America, and co-working spaces. And we got featured on TechCrunch, BBC, many, I think, Financial Times, a few others. And co-working spaces open, every day throughout the world, right? Like I could have talked to a journalist and said like, oh, we have our chairs are this size. These are the dimensions of the space, but that's not interesting. The image the story that I pitched, and I'm happy to send the exact email that got us on TechCrunch, is we're creating this because we want to turn this city into the Silicon Valley of Latin America. And I tied it into something bigger. So that's kind of what I mentioned for even the smaller founders. Almost all founders I meet, even if they're working on something smaller, they tend to have these kind of greater ideas of what they want it to become, and that's what you should really focus on.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd love to see that email. I think I'll send people to wpcurve.com/startup-press. And we'll include that email now. I'm getting a bit of an echo on your side. I don't know if you've got. Did you just change your audio settings or something? Or?
No. But let me move a little closer to the microphone.
Whoop.
Can you hear me a little better?
Yeah, no, I could hear you. It's just I could also hear myself. I think I don't know. You don't have earphones, do you?
I do.
Like the microphone's picking up the computer's audio.
Let me see. I'm just playing around with the settings to see if it might help at all.
You don't have earphones?
Oh, I do. But, let me see. Let me try.
You can grab them. I can edit this out later. That's cool. Because what's happening is my audio is coming out of your computer and going back into the mic, and I can just hear it.
Yeah. Let me see.
All right, how we going? You hear me?
Let me see. I can hear you perfectly. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah. Is your computer no longer using your mic, or is it using the?
Oh, it's using this earphone.
Okay. Do you want to change it back so the audio sounds the same? Do you know how to do that? If you click on the cog, the settings cog, if you mouse over up the top.
Yeah.
Oh, so the default speaker should be. Okay.
No, speaker's fine, but the microphone should be your USB microphone.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
So if actually, I might be able to share my screen to show you what I mean. But if you click that settings cog, you should have two drop downs, one for the mic and one for the.
Yeah.
speakers.
Does this work right now?
Yeah.
Okay. So you don't hear the echo, but you hear me well?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Apologies for that.
No, that's cool. I'm gonna just clap because then I'll be able to see in the audio file where we get back on.
Okay. Perfect.
Right. All right, cool. So that's a good idea, and I haven't really heard people talk about that so much before. So what about the actual process? If they are kind of good at articulating their vision and they are able to tie this into a bigger story, then what do they do? Do they kind of get a bunch of people in a spreadsheet and kind of line them up just before the launch, or?
I think it's really important that everyone understand that journalists are going to write stories that are emailed to them about. So at VentureBeat, as an example, about 50% of our stories every day were stories that were written to tips@venturebeat.com. So I think there's kind of this assumption like, hey, no one ever reads tips at TechCrunch, but all of those emails are read every single day. And emails sent to individual journalists are read every day. And this is really important because a lot of people, they use sites such as they use syndication sites such as prweb.com, Newswire, and those tend to be great for SEO. But I've never met a journalist who said, "Oh, I just saw this great story on PR Newswire. I want to write about it." They're really going to write about.
I don't think they're even great for SEO. I think it's just like I think SEO these days is smart enough to know when some article is just a shitty site with heaps of dodgy links to a million different syndicated rubbish, and the difference between that and an actual legitimate article on an authority site.
I mean that's a really good point, and I think no, you're right. I mean, if they haven't already picked up on it, they will know very shortly. But I know a lot of people who say, what I spent $1,000 to syndicate this site, and no one picked up on it. But you really shouldn't expect that. So it's important that you individually contact the journalist. And that you state really clearly not only what you are announcing. So, for example, if a company is announcing its launch, it should say that, but that you also include a press release. And a press release is essentially people make it seem very fancy. It's just a way that a company can communicate to the media what it is announcing, and it has a specific format that journalists are accustomed to reading. And one of the things that's really important is that I think there's this big discussion about whether press releases are dead. So I'm a firm believer that press releases aren't dead, but when you email a journalist, it's not that they read the press release and say, hey, this is something I really want to cover. What happens is when you email them the announcement and why it's meaningful, in the email they determine whether they want to write about it. And once they determine whether they want to write about it, they'll look at the press release, and your goal is basically to reduce as much friction as possible. So to add so much information that they'll say, hey, not only do I want to write about it, but you've made it so easy for me that it's only going to take me 20 minutes to publish an article, as opposed to multiple hours.
Is part of that also, if you include a press release that's done in a reasonable way, then that also adds to the kind of the proof factor that you're legitimate and that you're not kind of wasting their time?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And it's really important now because increasingly so, and I think even more so in the future, most of these journalists are paid per article. So if you imagine yourself in those shoes, if they're looking at this story, they're going to think, hey, this story is going to take me 20 minutes to write, or maybe it's going to take me 4 hours to write because of all the research. And if you can do a lot of that research ahead of time, they know it's going to save them a lot of time, they're going to be much more likely to cover the story.
That's a good idea. So things like the size of the dollar value of the industry you're working in, and stats like that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So things like, for example, WP curve, you could say, our goal is to disrupt this portion of the WordPress industry, and every single year, X number of publications use WordPress, this amount of dollar values. Having that Because, and I think one of the reasons Publicize worked well, but I think anyone can do this, is if you have an idea of what they want to write about, you can kind of deconstruct that back into a press release. And knowing that a lot of the data points you send are going to be included in the article.
Yeah. Just, can I go back one step? How do you even know, like you mentioned tips at VentureBeat before, is this like a industry thing where that's the email address for every publication, or do you have to know the journalists, or how do you get a list of these people together?
So I think tips is pretty common, although it's not universal. One of the things my company did for free, we spent 100 hours collecting the emails of different publications and different journalists. So we actually have that list that we published for free. I can actually send you the link.
That's a great idea,
Yeah, just to let you know with that, we actually emailed each of the journalists and told them that we'd remove their name if they wanted to. But the shocking thing is we almost had essentially 0 journalists asked to be removed, but we have a lot of journalists asking to be added on, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that email that'll really help people to be able to really see, hey, here's a list of a few hundred of the top tech publications, and their emails that I can contact them at.
Yeah, and do you find that, like, if you are to know a journalist's individual email, are they more likely to give that consideration over just the general tips one?
Yeah, I do recommend first contacting the individual journalists.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Oh, that would be really useful if you can send a link to that.
Yeah,
then,
of course.
Yeah, so the URL will be wpcurve.com/startup-press, or just wpcurve.com/67. We'll forward through to there.
Yeah, I'm happy to send it.
Yeah. So the process so far is sort of work out who these journalists are, and I guess you've done some of that work. It's probably not every business is going to be launching a tech startup, and I'm guessing there's like verticals where businesses should be doing their own research, or maybe you do that as part of the service as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the reason why I'm bullish on why I think startups, if it does have a component of technology, they should look at sites such as TechCrunch, is that you can really separate new and old media, and they actually operate very differently. So the reason why a site like a TechCrunch, some of the benefit that it has is that a lot of older media, so sites like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, they look to early adopter sites such as TechCrunch for story ideas. So for example, when I was on the Financial Times, they said, hey, I just saw your article on TechCrunch. Can we interview for an article? And it kind of provides this social proof to kind of more mainstream media. But if it's okay, can I just mention another point about the announcement? And once people determine their announcement and they start emailing a journalist, especially if you're an entrepreneur that's starting out, I recommend using something called an exclusive. And one of the things that's important with media is that today, because everything's essentially digital, it's very easy for publications to take stories from one another. And a publication, they know when they're getting pitched a story that the same email is being sent to maybe 100 or 200 other publications. So one of the ways, and because of that, if you're a TechCrunch journalist getting 1,000 emails every day, it's very hard to choose the 10 stories you're going to want to write about. One of the ways to differentiate yourself through the crowd is to offer an exclusive. And what that means is that publication has the first right to publish the story. And I find that this is very effective to kind of standing out from the crowd and giving your a much better chance to being covered. So it's very likely, for example, I just got written by Business Insider today, and in the email they said, hey, I normally wouldn't cover this story, but I really appreciate the exclusive, so we're happy to cover it. So I really recommend that.
How does that? I've always wondered how that process works. Like if I say email TechCrunch and say I'd love you to cover, our launch of a new part of the business or something significant, and you've got it as an exclusive. What if I don't hear back and we're getting close to that date? What do we do then?
Yeah. So usually I'd recommend waiting 24 hours. So as an example, let's say you have the announcement, you're ready, and on Monday you email TechCrunch and you don't hear a response. On Tuesday, if you email VentureBeat or Mashable, another publication, And hypothetically, let's say TechCrunch wrote you back, you would be in the right to say, hey, my apologies, I really wanted you to have it, but like, I wrote Mashable today and they agreed to cover the story, and I don't want to back out from that.
But would they actually tell you all the time? Or would they just go, oh, we got this email, there's no news on today, we might as well cover this?
Oh, well, so if they're interested, they're going to respond, and usually they'll respond and say, hey, I have a few questions. Some publications insist on having phone interviews, others don't. So it kind of depends on the circumstance. But if I were, so let's say you look at, let's say go back in time, you're about to launch WP Curve, and you say, okay, our announcement is our launch. Let's make this story much bigger. So try and disrupt this very large WordPress industry that's multi-millions, billions in size with this revolutionary model, which it is a fantastic model. And the very first thing is you could say, okay, we're really interested in having this feature on technology publications where our audience is. Let's reach out on Monday to TechCrunch. We'll email 4 different writers to see if they want to cover it. Maybe on Tuesday, if you don't hear anything back, you can follow up with the earlier journalists, and then you can follow up with maybe 3 or 4 other TechCrunch journalists, maybe tips at TechCrunch as well. Let's say by Wednesday you're like, hey, we haven't heard back. Maybe they're just not interested. Let's email VentureBeat as an example, and if not that, maybe Mashable, etc. And the goal of it is that one of these leading publications will agree to it in a specific date. And one of the benefits I see is that you essentially guarantee yourself a level of coverage by doing that, if you do it right and if you get people interested. And what I mean by that is, I had the other week this was last month, a friend of mine is getting his MBA at Stanford, and he's about to launch this product, and he spent maybe 9 months on it developing this. And he said, hey, Conrad, we're going to launch on, let's say, like May 15th. So a week ahead of time, we're going to email 20 publications to see if they want to cover it. So what ended up happening is May 15th came, no one covered the publication except a small blog, and they brought it online. And when you think about it, once that small blog covers that, and that's indexed online, they can never launch again. So they essentially lost this really great opportunity, as opposed to take the alternative. Let's say they focused on an exclusive for TechCrunch. They essentially guarantee that TechCrunch is going to cover, or a leading publication is going to cover that, and once it comes online, they furthered coverage. And by doing that, you keep the reward, but you minimize the risk, I think, to a great degree.
Yeah. I'm still really interested in your business and how you managed to do all of that for $400 a month.
Yeah. Well, I think because the benefit that I had from this is that I never had any background in the PR industry. So I think if people had worked in the PR industry, they'd have this idea of hey, we have to charge at least $5,000 a month as an example and build it up, as opposed to if you're looking at it from fresh lens and really deconstruct each process and each point of the way, say, hey, how can we reduce the cost as much as possible to pass the savings onto customers? By doing that, I think you come up with a really different model. In a lot of ways, actually, I look at WP Curve as well, and I'm like, wow, this model is fantastic. Like, how do they do that? Because it's such a different take on the industry.
Yeah, but I think like with our business, it's pretty mechanical in nature, because like we only do really, really specific work. Like we do small jobs in WordPress that WordPress developers do. So we don't do SEO, we don't do design, we don't do copywriting or PR or anything outside of those small jobs. We don't do big jobs, we don't do projects, new websites. And so like for us, it like when I started, I could kind of see that I could just continue to grow that by hiring people who could be affordable to do this work. Whereas with your stuff like this, it seems like such a massive gray area, and all of this stuff, like every single company's got a different story. Most of the time, they probably don't even know what the story is. Like, how do you get that out of people? What if they just don't have an interesting story or a vision?
Well, yeah, I think the good thing is if when we talk to a client, they usually have it. One of their announcements can fit into a certain point. So whether it's a launch, whether it's a mobile app, and so it's not too hard to get it out of. I think we were so used to adding just a ton of social proof and making the stories seem much larger that in some ways it's like it's a default for what I mean. We're really used to it, I think.
But it kind of sounds like you work with more like funded startups and stuff, and I think like those guys probably all do have an interesting story for someone like TechCrunch, whereas at $400 a month price point, like I could just see like small businesses opening local shops and going, we may as well pay you, it's only $400. So what do you do when people are just launching something that's not really that exciting?
Yeah, so what we decided was I wanted this to be really entrepreneur friendly. A lot of the ways I created this to be a service that I'd want to use. So what we say when we first speak to a client is it's $4.99 a month, no retainer, you can cancel at any time. If we believe your company has less than 70% chance of being featured on a leading publication, we give a $50 a month discount. And if we believe less than a 40% chance, we give a $75 a month discount. Basically to say, hey, we do have companies who come with us. Actually, one recently, and he did get good results. But like, we're really upfront to say.
So the clients who are going to be the hardest clients to work with, you charge them less.
Yeah.
That's insane. That makes no sense at all.
And I
you should just not have them as clients. If they're lower than 40% chance, you're going to have to work your ass off, and then you're not even going to get paid.
I mean, I think but the challenging part about it is that like the thing with PR is that we can only really promise the work that's going to go on. You can never really promise the results, because I could show you specific examples, and I could send you links later of people who've been featured. I mean, you're talking about a Chicago insurance executive who's 65 years old, has no connection anywhere towards Silicon Valley, New York. He's being featured on the Next Web, VentureBeat, all these really big publications. And his site, if you look at it, you'd say like, there's no way. So there's always a chance, but I think it's more that we want to be as transparent as possible to say, hey, you can work with us because we don't believe there's anyone who can provide what we provide for the price that we provide it at. But we want you to know that we think you have less a chance of getting the results that you're looking for.
Right, and do you do that in the hope that they won't sign up? I mean, they will sign up if it halves the price. Anyway, I got to move on from this. I think that's crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Now I've got one more question about the TechCrunch thing. One of the things that I've always thought about TechCrunch is like I've had my companies featured in other places, not on TechCrunch, because like TechCrunch seems to really focus on the funding aspect. Like I feel like if I was to get funding for a company, I could get featured on TechCrunch. Whereas if I was just doing something interesting, or if I had interesting content to write, I could probably get on NextWeb or Mashable or something. Is that just me being incorrect there, or?
I think that there are certain publications. So, like for example, the Next Web, they tend. I don't know if it's more of a recent policy to shy away from covering funding stories. Well, sites like VentureBeat might be more likely to. I think it's fun. I think TechCrunch will cover any meaningful announcement. And there's a misconception that to be meaningful, it has to be funding, but that's really not true. Actually, if you can get small feature updates featured on these top publications. But the importance of it isn't necessarily just the feature, it's rather the story that you weave it into. And anyone can do that. So, I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example. So, it's more about just making the story much bigger. So, and I'll give you an example. So, Publicize we're expected to be featured on TechCrunch. We heard back from a journalist, but Publicize, if you think about it, is a services company. And it's unlikely that any tech publication would cover a services company because there tends to be a bias towards startup. But I didn't frame it as a services company. I framed it as, hey, like we want to disrupt this really large industry, and we believe we can because we have the right background, et cetera. So I just think that I think anyone from people shouldn't put these limits on themselves. Because those limits.
Yeah. I'll ask that question another way, which might be interesting to some people who are going after funding. If you do get funding, even a small amount of funding, is that the kind of thing where it's almost guaranteed that is an interesting story to someone like TechCrunch, and if you're not getting covered, at that point, then you're kind of doing something wrong?
So I wouldn't say it's a guarantee, because at the end of the day, TechCrunch might get 2,000 emails and they can only cover 40, 50 stories a day. So it's hard to ever put a guarantee, but it is a very interesting announcement. One of the misconceptions people have is that they need to raise a certain amount of money to be featured. So they have to raise at least 250,000 as an example. And there are ways you can kind of go about it. I think as long as you're raising 100,000, six-figure digit, it's worth reaching out about it.
Yeah.
I think if it's any bit less, you can say something like, they're the kind of little strategies you can use. As an example, you could say, we raised angel funding, but we prefer the angel investors to prefer not to disclose the exact amount.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's say you only raised 50,000, and there are many journalists who would still cover that announcement.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was just thinking, like, I know people who've got like a bit of funding from kind of friends, family, maybe some investors who they kind of know, maybe like 100 grand, 150 grand funding that maybe is not a significant amount of money, and maybe it's not even called an A round, but you could kind of frame that in a way that like there's people who are putting money into this because they think it's an interesting opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that would make a great announcement.
Okay. Do you want me to keep going through my list, or do you have anything else to add to that kind of broad topic?
No, I guess just to go off, it's just that one of the things I can't emphasize enough are two big misconceptions. I think the first, that people have to pay $10,000 a month for a PR firm. People can do it themselves. There's no reason not to. I think the second is that people need to be friends with journalists to contact them. So one of the things that I've been testing a lot is I mentioned the 65-year-old who was featured on VentureBeat. He's a retired insurance executive. He founded a company called Safely Filed. If you actually Google search Safely Filed, you'll say like, wow, I can't believe this site was featured on here. And a lot of people, when they were featured on VentureBeat, they said, Conrad, of course they were featured on VentureBeat. You know journalists there. And I said, no, you're wrong. Because actually, when I emailed VentureBeat and got them featured there, I emailed on behalf of the founder. He asked me, I talked to him, and we agreed to do that. So if you follow the right process, you don't need to necessarily have these. You don't need to be best friends with a TechCrunch journalist to get featured there. And I think that's a big misconception that people make.
Yeah, that's definitely the I guess the general message, which I mean, it probably makes sense to kind of try to build relationships with these journalists if you can.
Yeah.
But man, it's hard work. Just even like I actually was just talking to Alex about this before this call, because we have a meeting every 2 weeks. 2 meetings every week. And one of the things is like, how do we better manage this process of getting press? Because like we've been able to get press from different places, but we don't really have any structure around it. So it's like, but it's actually a hard thing to manage, to kind of work out like when to reach out to these people and how we can sort of help them to keep the relationship alive and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think probably and maybe an easy solution for you and WP Curve is looking at the next year and saying, okay, for this next year, our aim is to have 4 newsworthy announcements that we can reach out to the press. Could be something smaller. Could be, again, even a milestone. You reach X amount of revenue. And I would just encourage you to. I mean, a great way to keep a relationship as live is to offer an exclusive, because if you actually offer an exclusive, that means a lot to a journalist, because it says a lot about your kind of respect for them.
Yeah.
And I think if you every few months aim to do this, it's just going to compound the results over time.
Yeah, and you just gave me an idea, actually, because there was a guy who covered my last company, who maybe would be interested in covering this next story I've got in my mind, and I guess it would be nice for me to give him an exclusive, as well as he probably knows me and probably would be happy to do it. Yeah.
And one thing, once the exclusive comes online and you reach out to journalists, there's usually about I would say a 48 to 72 hour window for the story, if that. But ideally, once it comes online, you're going to try to further coverage as much as possible. And there's kind of a misconception that just if VentureBeat covers the story, that Mashable is not going to pick up on it. It's not only would Mashable still likely cover the story, but it's very common for publications to take stories from one another as well. So
So how would that process work? Would you be still reaching out to them afterwards and say, "Oh, sorry, I gave the exclusive to someone else, but I'd still like you to cover it"?
Well, usually it goes in kind of the following order. So let's say TechCrunch covers your next announcement, and they cover it at Monday at 12 o'clock. Ideally, within the next, I would say, 5 hours, you'll have emailed all the other tech publications, and they'll give you kind of a quick answer of, hey, yes, I want to cover it, and you'll let them know that the announcement comes out on that day. So they should really cover it that day because you'll date it on your press release. And then the following day, you'll reach out to more traditional media. And the reason why is newer media, especially technology, they're very time sensitive. As opposed to if you reached out to, let's just say hypothetically, the BBC the next day, they really wouldn't care if the story had come out the day before because they're just less time sensitive. And then after that, you'd reach out to individual verticals. So, for example, for WP Curve, you could say, okay, day one, let's focus, tech publications that are really time sensitive. Day two, more mainstream. It could be, for example, publications in Australia, more mainstream news publications. And then day three, you'd focus, for example, on publications that focus on WordPress, who aren't very time sensitive, or much less so than the other ones.
And what does that pitch email look like?
It depends on the. It really depends on the situation. So, an example, let's say on Monday you get featured on TechCrunch, and on Tuesday you're following up with Australian publications. You really want to emphasize, hey, we're this Australian startup that obviously the Australians, you'd focus more on that than you would necessarily in other parts. So
would you mention that you were covered in TechCrunch like the day before, as like a sort of social proof type thing?
Yeah. So for publications that don't identify themselves as competition to TechCrunch, you should, because it says a ton. But you'd probably be shooting yourself in the foot if you emailed VentureBeat with the TechCrunch link as an example.
Good
just because they would they definitely wouldn't be as happy about that. Or a lot of the publications they would say something like, hey, I just saw TechCrunch covered this, so I don't know if we're going to, but please let us know when you have your next announcement because we'd love to cover it. They would say something friendly like that.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Okay, that makes sense. All right. So I've got a couple more final questions. We sort of talked. One of the questions I had before we started was how to find stories. I don't know if that's a question you can answer. Is like we talked about, if you're getting funding, that could be a story. If you've got like a vision, that's interesting, you're launching something. What are other examples of stories? Like I think you mentioned milestones, like for things. Yeah. Maybe revenue, hitting certain revenue. Are there other things?
Yeah, I think kind of smaller examples that are maybe less used. Things like a site rebrands. Maybe it changes its name, changes its URL. It might take on a board of advisor or a board of directors. It might take on a new member of its executive team. Might acquire a company if the company itself gets sold. That's a newsworthy announcement. Those would all work really well. I think another example of those tend to be very startup specific. If let's say you're a part of a consulting firm and you want to get PR, a lot of consulting firms would approach it differently because consulting firms tend to be featured less often. An example of what they could do is if they did a study or research on a specific area and they found some insight, they could promote that insight as an exclusive to a publication. If they created an infographic, I'm sure you've seen a lot of publications have infographics and then it's branded by the company. That would work as well. I think an area that people don't look into enough are guest articles as well. Publications are very open to accepting guest articles, kind of on that kind of if you have this industry expertise.
Yeah, just during the week I put a post up on Medium, and then one of the writers from the NextWeb emailed me an intro to the contributor manager from NextWeb, and they're just looking for articles like all the other guys are. So if you're kind of writing stuff that's appealing to people, then that's obviously a really good way. And we did that with some of the Australian publications as well. We do guest posting for them just on completely unrelated topics that may not be related to WP Curve. But then when there is a WP Curve story, they're much more likely to kind of accept that on their site.
Oh yeah, I think absolutely.
Well, that's cool. There's a lot of ideas there. Maybe my last question, last two questions. One is, are there any sort of top resources? There just seems like in this industry, there's like a lot of BS and a lot of like, I can't tell you how to do it. You just have to pay us how to do it. Are there places where like you go to learn more about this stuff, or where like a founder can go to learn? I mean, you mentioned a few on your own site, but are there other like podcasts or other blogs or?
I mean, to be honest, one of the reasons why I'm much more active now so for example, Sean Ellis, I did a blog actually just deconstructing the PR process. Is that there isn't, I kind of consider us, I would say, pushing kind of on the frontier of the PR material that's coming out. A lot of blog posts you see, it's 500 words on the benefits of PR. You kind of look at it and think, I know the benefits already. Well, Sean's actually kind of an interesting case, because when I wrote the guest article for Sean, I broke it down for growth hackers, and I wrote an example email, and then I just used that exact email and got them featured on VentureBeat. You can actually Google search VentureBeat growth hackers, and you'll see the article. And
send me a link to the article, and I'll put it on our site.
That sounds perfect. Yeah, you'll see a nice photo of Sean there.
Sean has been on our podcast as well, so if people go to wpcurve.com/blog and put in Sean Ellis in the search on the right-hand side, you'll get to that episode, and it was one of the best episodes we did. He's a smart dude.
I think Sean, I mean, I attribute so much of my career to actually him. When I first came across his blog, the stuff he was writing about I'd never seen before. But about the PR resources, I created a free beginner's guide to PR. I think if you use that in addition to the contact reporter list I created, I think it'll get you pretty far. Let me see. I think
I would have loved that sort of stuff a year ago when I was kind of doing all this stuff for myself without knowing what I was doing. And I was lucky enough to get covered with my last business on the Next Web and like a little mention on Mashable. But man, it was so much work, because I think so much of that work was just wasted work because I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think those should get people pretty far. I'm trying to think of other PR.
You should do a podcast. You should do a podcast.
Yeah. No, I mean,
they're good. They're a good way to build relationships, and I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked for if there's any specific PR podcasts. I know On Boardly do a fair bit of content. We've done a bit of content with those guys, but yeah, I think podcasts are awesome, and like this kind of content is really good for that medium as well, because it's like people would love to just hear the stories about, like the Sean Ellis one you mentioned. Sounds like an awesome piece of content, and that kind of stuff is good for podcasts. Like you could just interview Sean on an episode and talk it through and give people some tips, and Anyway, I'm really telling you what to do. I don't know why I'm doing that.
No, and I think, I mean, my hope even with talking to you is that people can come away not just thinking about that they can get PR on their own, but like with really actionable steps. I mean, one of actually the interesting things that you might be able to do with WP Curve is that because WP Curve already has, it's hard for it to do a launch as an example because it has prior coverage and it's already been around. You could frame an announcement as a relaunch and see if that gets picked up by different stories. And you might be able to add in it relaunched, and part of this was we included this new product. But
okay.
The thing is, if you're really efficient about it, like if you just think about your time and say, okay, you know what, we're gonna look at this example of a press release. We're gonna spend today writing the press release, and then on Monday we're gonna reach out to the Next Web and see if they want to cover it. And then you can basically determine after a week whether someone's gonna pick up on it or not. Yeah. So in terms of time, I think if you're really efficient and focusing on the things that matter most, it's not as time intensive as opposed to I think other forms of marketing.
Yeah. Hey, I've got one more question, a selfish question.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
One thing that's crossed my mind is like the fact that our business is 100% remote and we've grown to a team of 13 people in less than a year, and I've never met my co-founder. Like those kind of weird aspects to our business. Is that the kind of stuff that's interesting to these publications?
So it is. But the one thing to remember is that when you're promoting a story, you have the primary story, and then you have secondary stories. Yeah. So as an example, let's say you decide you want to announce your relaunch and you want this to be featured on the next web. The name of their press release could be something like Serial Entrepreneur relaunches WP Curve, aims to reimagine the way we approach WordPress development. And then the second story, kind of below that, would be some interesting facts. So one could be, co-founders at Denver we met one, which is very fascinating. A second one could be, for example, this is an example of one of the burgeoning Australian startups, which is really growing, although people aren't talking about it enough. And you can kind of add in these secondary stories, and the idea is that in combination with the primary story, people would really be interested about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's really helpful. So that's been awesome. I'm gonna definitely use some of this stuff myself. And I guess if people are listening, I really like it when people get on our site and comment on these episodes. And particularly, I mean, it's nice when people say, yeah, that was a nice episode, but what I really love is when they kind of tell us that they got something out of this that's really actionable and that they're going to use or that they already have used. And that really tells us that we're on track with the content that we're putting out, because we're putting out things that people are actually using, as opposed to just kind of, yeah, that was interesting. So if anyone listens to this and you use any of these tactics or use any of the resources that Conrad's mentioned, then definitely get on wpcurve.com/startup-press and leave us a comment at the bottom and just tell us exactly what you used and how it worked, and we'd love to hear those sort of stories. So just to wrap up, what's the best way for people to find you and to reach out if they have any more questions?
I would say my email is conrad@publicize.co. I think www.publicize.co is the best way to find me. Any email on that site, I'm sure I'll get. I just say the last thing is, if there are any PR questions, I'm happy to answer them in the comments. Also, if people want to present a potential story and hear my feedback, I can recommend publications that they should contact and kind of feedback for it. And one of the things I'm happy to do is, if you decide to, I'm happy to draft a press release for WP Curve, and it could be, for example, about its relaunch. And this could be for you privately, or if you want to publish it on the blog post. But
we should do that. We'll publish it. That would be awesome. I'm keen to do that.
But I really encourage you to use it. Kind of reminds me of Sean Ellis when I was doing the guest article, I just said, I've already created all this material. Let me just get you the coverage. And but I think if you use that press release, it'll probably be a good example, and it'll get you some good coverage as well.
We would definitely use that, and this will make it a much more useful piece of content for people if we're able to use that and get some results out of it.
Sounds
Maybe
perfect.
We'll do a follow-up blog post and explain the process. So that would be super cool. Excellent. Thanks for coming on, and I'll talk to you offline about that.
Yeah, sounds, Dan. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.